how's it going? Welcome to chapter 25, Latin American Revolutions. We're continuing our discussion of revolutions. We talked about we've had the three chapters in a row, right, where we've talked about revolutions, right? Chapter 23, we talked about two revolutions. Anybody remember what those were? They were political. The American Revolution and the French Revolution, right? The American Revolution was the only successful revolution at this time in the 18th, 19th century because the colonists had a history of representative government. So revolutions are kind of two parts. You know, it's one thing to gain your independence. A lot of people can do that, overthrow your monarchy, right? Or overthrow your current government. But it's another to actually set up freedom, to actually set up, a successful government. And the American colonists were able to do that because of their history. Then we talked about the French Revolution, right? And that long struggle went on for over 20 years. They overthrew their monarchs. They set up a democracy, and I say that with quotes, like the republic, like they call it that, the Jacobins, which it was even more extreme than anything they'd ever seen. The Reign of Terror, from 1793, 1794, and the guillotine, and Robespierre, and things just got completely out of hand, and stuff. And then they got rid of that and went to the Directory, and then eventually go to Napoleon, go back to an emperor who declares himself emperor, and in the end up right back where they started, with a monarch or an emperor, however you want to call it, a dictator, somebody in charge. Declare war on all of Europe. At the end of it, Napoleon is defeated and removed, and then a distant relative of Louis, who they executed, is then put on the throne. Chapter 24, we talked about a different kind of revolution, right? We talked about the Industrial Revolution, an economic revolution, right? That is changing the way we consume, the way we produce, the way we consume, the way we work. How machinery helps our world become smaller, right? It takes the process of man-made labor, right? And it makes it faster. And factories, and the steam engine was really the backbone of that, okay? And we see a total revolution of economics, but also of social structure, right? The way people live, the gap between the rich and the poor. So we see a lot of positives from the Industrial Revolution, but we see a lot of negatives too. We see horrible working conditions. We see a lot of atrocities toward women, toward children, medical issues, abuses of power, and stuff that are terrible. And so it brings about the Enlightenment and the questioning of what responsibility does government have toward its people. And so the Industrial Revolution, while it's an economic movement, has a lot of discussion about it, right? That has socially, politically become involved. While this is going on, the Latin American revolutions begin, right? Okay, they are influenced by the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and Napoleon provides an opportunity. Now, before we get this started, I should say, you should have already watched, as I said in the module, okay, or as I said online, you should have already watched the crash course, World History, Latin American Revolutions, just to give you a really good basis, okay? John Green does a really good job of giving you a laydown of this chapter, so you should have already watched crash course and done the video sheet. Also, you should have read the chapter outline, okay? You need to read the chapter outline. The PowerPoint that I'm going to go through that I have for this chapter is not super detailed. It's short. There's no pictures. Some of you rely too much on the pictures, okay? There's not a lot of pictures and stuff like that. So we are going to go through this in shorter format than normal. So it is important that you have done those ahead of time, so that this lecture and that these notes will make sense. Now, we are going to do I have assigned, or if you want to, you can complete the worksheet, chapter 25 worksheet, as we go through, because I will be covering most of those topics and trying to stop and give you a good discussion and just to help you understand. So here's the gist or the goal of this chapter. Okay, here's what it's all about. What caused the Latin American revolutions? What are some differences between them? So Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela. Just knowing basic differences. Don't need to know a lot, but just basic. And then in the end, why do they not succeed? They succeed in gaining their freedom, but why do they not succeed in setting up freedom, independent government? So they succeed in breaking away from Spain or breaking away from Brazil, but they don't actually succeed in the ultimate goal, which is freedom for the lower class people, right? The rich are still in charge and they take advantage of the poor. And why is that? Well, it's going to be the same reasons that the French Revolution fails. and the same reasons why the American Revolution succeeded. So we're going to kind of go through this, but my whole goal is to help you see big picture, the theme that I've been trying to bring together. Okay, so here we go. So if you haven't grabbed that worksheet, I would grab that. So what are the underlying reasons or causes, the roots of the struggle for independence in Latin America? So here are basically some of the things, okay? So first and foremost, they are inspired by the American and the French Revolution. So first, the American Revolution was probably the biggest inspiration. You know, a bunch of colonists just north of them, think about that. They kind of feel like, well, they're like us. You know, they were oppressed by the European power and they broke away against all the odds. You know, we can do that. So they're inspired by the American Revolution. The French Revolution provided the opportunity. Now, here's what I mean by that. These weren't French colonies. Latin America was mostly colonized by the Spanish, with the exception of Brazil, right, which was colonized by the Portuguese. So you're like, well, how does that provide opportunity? Can anybody give me Napoleon? How does Napoleon fall into this? Good. So the French Revolution does inspire them, but Napoleon provides the opportunity because these revolutions happen toward the end of the French Revolution when Napoleon is invading. Remember last chapter or in chapter 23 we talked about the chaos that Napoleon created. He invades Spain. He killed the monarch of Spain. The Portuguese monarchs, right, flee to Brazil, leave their country. Can you imagine your monarch's just like, bye? Can you imagine, like, if your house is under siege and your parents just jump in the car and leave you at home? They're like, bye, good luck. You're like, wait, why are you leaving us? Like, can you imagine the people of Portugal? They're like, are you going to stay and, like, fight for us? They're like, nope, go into Brazil. It's warm there. I'm going to be good. In fact, did you see in the crash course, he didn't even want to go home when he was supposed to? So Napoleon provides the opportunity, right? Triggers it because he provides opportunity because he invades Spain and Portugal, okay? There was a lot of inequality. The Creoles were upset about their unfair treatment. Now remember, Peninsulares, and Peninsulares are of European descent. Creoles are not of European descent, and they are tired of the second-rate treatment. They're tired of being treated differently. The distance, these colonies are being used for their raw goods. So the Industrial Revolution is going on during this, okay? And a lot of these goods are being taken back to Europe to be manufactured. So they're being used for their raw goods. Think about it when you go to the grocery store. What do you pay more for? A jar of spaghetti sauce or a tomato? You pay more for the jar of spaghetti sauce. Why? Because it's processed, it's manufactured, right? So they're taking raw goods out of these colonies, paying low value, like taking tomatoes, and they're taking them back to Europe and they're processing it and they're making the profits off that. So it's the same kind of concept of the Industrial Revolution where Karl Marx was talking about how the bourgeoisie are getting rich off the proletariats, the rich keep getting richer off the backs of the poor. Well, this is how the colonies felt. This is how Latin Americans felt. They felt like the Europeans, the Spanish, the Portuguese are getting rich off of their plantations, are getting rich off their mines at their expense. It's like we're doing all the work, we're providing the product, yet we see none of the benefit. Plus, on top of that, they had to pay the royal fifth, right? What was that? The 20% tax. And the ideas of the Enlightenment were spreading. So first you're inspired by the American French Revolution, but you're also inspired by the Enlightenment. So these things go together, right? Which inspired revolution, which is we deserve better. We deserve to have a say in our government. So these things, question number 1 on your worksheet, these are the things that inspired or were the roots of the revolution. So you want to list several of these. Okay, so this isn't on the worksheet, but I do think it's really important to understand the concept of regionalism, okay? Regionalism had more issues in Latin America than it did in the United States, and this is part of the reason that Latin America wasn't as successful as the United States, particularly with Simón Bolivar with his Gran Colombia, right, that he attempted to set up. So regionalism was felt more in Latin America. It was more diverse in Latin America, right? I believe it was 25–30% of the population in Latin America was mixed. So there's a lot of diversity, mixed racial, mixed cultural backgrounds. So the social hierarchy was very racially driven. A lot of splitting between nations, but also not a lot of movement of people. And because of this, It doesn't matter if you and I lived maybe 200 miles separate from each other. If there was a mountain range or something between us, we probably never had contact. So culturally, we felt very distant from one another. Whereas in the United States, there was a lot more movement of people. So there was a lot more continuity of culture and beliefs and ideas. So it was easier to set up a more unified government, a more unified state than it was in Latin America. So when Simon Bolivar tries to set up his Gran Colombia with Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia, okay, so Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia from 1819 to 1830, the problem that he came across was it was so multicultural that people just, different languages, different backgrounds, different focuses, and people just didn't relate to one another, and so they weren't on the same page. Whereas in the United States, because of the British roots and being loyal to the British crown, then being loyal to fighting against the British crown, it made it easier to come together. Also, the British colonists, the United States colonists, or the American colonists, I should say, that formed the United States, had a history of representative government with constitutional monarchy with the British, right? They had a history of that. So when they developed the independence under the U.S. Constitution, because of that practice they had had in voting in British government, in voting in Parliament, just because you vote doesn't mean you get your way. I've said this before. Part of what people get wrong is democracy isn't always about winning. Actually, being really good at democracy is about being a good loser. It's expressing your opinion, and when you don't get it, when you don't get your way, knowing how to accept it and not overthrow, right? Not throw a fit, not raise up an army. And the people of Latin America had no experience with this, So part of the reason also that regionalism really affected Latin America more is because when things didn't go one area's way, there was a lot more uprising, there was a lot more fighting and backlash. People just didn't know how to accept that because they weren't used to having an opportunity to express their opinion. And then when they didn't get their way, they didn't know what to do with that. It's like a child learning how to accept no. Those formative years of having a toddler, I'm coming out of it with my kids, sometimes they do a really good job at it, sometimes they don't, sometimes they throw a fit, and that's something as a parent you have to teach them to do. The American colonists had a head start because they had been taught with their British background how to handle that. Now, it doesn't mean that the U.S. was perfect, okay? Regionalism did affect them. Latin America had a lot of civil wars, and they ended up breaking up the Gran Colombia. United States had civil war, right? We had our civil war in the 1860s, and over many different things. The North wanting to, or the South wanting to break away from the North. Slavery was a part of that. Trade was a part of that. State rights was a part of that. There were a lot of things that caused the Civil War. Probably one of the biggest issues being slavery. So we were not immune. In North America, United States, we were not immune to regionalism. So something that was common about regionalism issues was civil war, diversity, but definitely it was more of an issue in Latin America. What effects did the independence and the end of colonialism have on the Amerindians? Well, unfortunately, they kind of traded one dictator for another. Okay, so overall, they were successful in getting rid of the Spanish, getting rid of the Portuguese, but unfortunately, in all of Latin America, none of them were successful in setting up a constitutional monarchy. In Brazil, they did that, but they didn't actually follow the Constitution. They didn't actually vote for their rights. None of them were successful in setting up a representative government. So really what these revolutions led to was the trading of a foreign dictator for a local dictator. And so the effects of colonialism kept on. They continued to export their raw goods. They continued to be abused by the rich. They continued to be taken advantage of. And the poor continued to suffer at the expense of the rich. What was different now was that rich was more local. And the foreign powers now, instead of being in charge, just traded and took those raw goods through trade power or through trade deals. And so unfortunately, in the long run, for a lot of Latin America, not a lot actually really changed in the daily lives of the poor, everyday people. So what's the difference between developed and underdeveloped nations? Okay, we've heard this before, maybe in our reference of terminologies today, like a third world country or a first world country. That's kind of what this is referencing, okay? So this is toward the end of your worksheet. kind of, So a developed nation is a nation that is pure and simple industrialized, okay? So nations that participated in the Industrial Revolution. So think about some nations that led the Industrial Revolution. Britain, Germany, France, United States, Canada. These would be considered industrialized nations, okay? Now, in North and South America, in the Americas, there were 3 nations that were considered developed, industrialized, okay? Meaning they had factories, they had machinery, they had the ability to take raw goods and manufacture them. Okay, so the ability to take raw goods and manufacture them. That's what it means to be industrialized at this time, okay? There was the United States, Canada, and then there's a random one that nobody ever really guessed, Argentina. Argentina was kind of outside of the mold because they had a very particular type of cattle that was world renowned that people wanted. So while they didn't have as many factories and industrialization in the traditional sense, they had cattle which people sought worldwide, which brought them in a lot of money and kind of quartered the market. But United States and Canada were definitely industrialized and could process raw goods into manufactured goods. Now, what does underdeveloped mean? Underdeveloped means just that. It's pure and simple exporting raw goods. It's a monoculture that produces one thing. When I say monoculture, I should say basically meaning monoeconomics, okay, is what I should say. Not monoculture, I should say monoeconomics, okay? One thing. So for instance, in Brazil, what was their one thing? Sugar, right? In the Caribbean, it was sugar, it was tobacco, it was cash crops, right? So in most of Latin South America, it was mines and it was cash crops, okay? So to be underdeveloped means no industrialization and the export of raw goods, which means you're getting paid the lowest amounts. Remember my example of like the tomato and tomato sauce. Okay, so United States, Canada could develop the tomato sauce, so to speak, or whatever the raw good was, develop it, right? Whereas all these Latin American countries are exporting the raw goods and the developed nations are taking those and then making the money off of it. So make sure in that response that you're giving the difference between them and you're listing countries that are examples of. In particular, what are the 3, in the Americas, what are the 3 countries that represent developed nations? So what was the nature of immigration to the Americas in the 19th century and what were some of the problems or contributions? So obviously a lot of immigration came through African slave trade, but by the 1800s that was really coming to an end. And so we're going to see a real shift in the 1800s from African immigration due to the slave trade to immigration from Asia. Okay, so from India, from South Asia, from China, and from Southeast Asia. Okay, from like Indonesia and islands, Philippines, things like that. And a lot of people coming over in what would be called indentured servitude. Okay, a lot of people coming over. There was also a lot of European migration. So there was a lot of European immigrants and seeking new opportunities, seeking the Industrial Revolution really pushed a lot of people to seek new business opportunities. The United States was booming. Canada was booming economically. They were industrialized nations that had a lot more opportunity than Europe had, especially for the lower classes. So if you were lower class and you wanted opportunity, Europe really didn't offer that and stuff. So if you wanted opportunity, the United States, Canada provided those opportunities. But there also was a huge influx of workers from now that the slave trade was ending for low-paying, low-paying jobs, factory jobs, but also field work, so cash crop jobs, mining jobs, things like that, especially on the West Coast in Latin America. And we're going to see, again, a lot coming from Asia. So we're going to see a huge influx of that. What are some of the factors that led to environmental issues? Well, because of this huge push for raw goods, they absolutely decimated the environments in the Americas, stripping areas of their forest. Brazil was just absolutely stripping the rainforest, to make space for new fields for sugarcane, or Cuba basically annihilated all the forest, so there was no wood product left on the whole island. Throughout the Americas, we see the same issues, all throughout, there was really no thought of what kind of impact are we having on the environment, and instead, instead, just jumping in and taking whatever they could. So a lot of issues with sewer, clean water, disposal, a lot of issues with timber, soil erosion. The timber industry really had, an impact pollution issues. So just like we've talked about, environmental issues in Europe due to the Industrial Revolution, there were a lot of environmental issues throughout the Americas, especially in Latin America. There wasn't as much intervention because the industrialized nations didn't care, and the governments of these nations in Latin America were so interested in making money that there was very little intervention and not a lot of money really put toward it. So probably some of the biggest devastation was definitely in Latin America due to the overuse of the fields in these areas for raw goods, right? For raw cash crops. And then last but not least, we're going to be on this one for a few minutes because we want to talk really quick about the difference between compare and contrast Venezuela, Mexican, and Brazil revolutions, and then why is it that these ultimately ended up failing and the American Revolution succeeded. Okay, so kind of the questions I haven't answered. So let's go through and let's talk about Brazil first. Okay, so on your worksheet, how is Brazil's struggle for independence different from Latin South America? Well, they went over that in the video, right? It was Portugal instead of Spain. So there was the one exception in the Latin American revolutions that was a Portuguese revolution, you could say, instead of Spanish. In this case, what's really interesting is that King John VI of Portugal had left his son, Pedro, back in Brazil. So when he was called back to Portugal, did anybody find that really funny that he had to be called back? And was I the only one like in Crash Course? You're like, really? He had to be called back? So he gets called back to Portugal. So first of all, right, Napoleon causes chaos in Europe, right? So the Portuguese monarchs, right, flee to Brazil to stay safe because the Spanish crown had been killed. So they're like, well, that could be us next. So they flee. When finally the dust settles and things are clear, it's time to go back. Okay, they've had in 1815, they've put things back together. It's time to go back and rule again. Your own people are like, are you coming home? And it's like, oh yeah, I guess I got to go home. So he leaves Pedro. And here I quote is what he said to Pedro. So I want you to imagine, okay, now if we were in class, this is one of my favorite things to do in class. So I'm going to do it with you here. Just play along with me, all right? But I think this will help ingrain in your memory and you'll remember, okay? So I want you to imagine a beach, okay? I don't know about you. We just finished winter break. How nice would it be to be on a beach right now, okay? Not be doing online learning, right? We'd all love to be on a beach, okay? So I want you to close your eyes for a second. And I want you to imagine you're on a beach, okay? And you're sitting in the sand and you're looking out at the ocean. And it's just, you hear the wind, it's a gorgeous day, the sun is out, there's a slight breeze, it's warm but not hot, it's perfect. And I just want you to sit with that for a second and hear the waves crashing. Do you hear it? Okay. And then I want you to look to your left, and I want you to notice, and you see a man walking toward the water. And he seems hurried, and there's another group of men walking behind him. And it draws your attention because they seem to be quite emotional and kind of talking, and you hear mumbling, but you can't quite understand and stuff. So you get up and you start kind of walking toward them because you're suspicious, you're curious, so you're going to go eavesdrop, pretend like you're doing a stroll on the beach, but you really want to eavesdrop on what's going on. So you start walking down the beach, and as you get closer, okay, your eyes are still closed, playing along here. I know I'm crazy, but hey, crazy times, let's do this, okay? And you're listening, and as you get closer, you start to hear this. Now, as you get closer, you notice one of the men is older, okay, probably in his 50s, all right? And he's clearly very wealthy, all right? He's wearing, really rich clothes, and they're very nice clothing, and stuff like that, very, very wealthy, okay? And in fact, as you're getting closer, you notice a very large ship out in the water, okay? And then you notice some men who appear to be in uniform rowing toward the shore, like they're coming to pick him up to take him out to this very large ship, okay? And this man, probably in his 50s, looks like he's going to meet them, but he's having a conversation with a younger man who's probably in his maybe early 20s, and they're trying to finish up this conversation. So anyways, you notice the ship now, and these very official men looking like they might be in the military or something like that, rowing toward the shore. And as you're getting closer and you're walking down the beach, okay, and the mumbling starts to become more clear and you start to hear it. Okay, and then you notice that the older man in his 50s is talking to the younger man, and he's in his early 20s. Okay, and then as you get closer, all right, you hear the young man in his 20s, and he seems very distressed and upset. Okay, and the younger man in his 20s is wearing a white shirt and appears to be related to this man. Maybe it's his father or his uncle, or something. They look kind of alike, but very attached to this man and upset that this older man is leaving. Okay, and as you're walking by and you're eavesdropping, because who doesn't like to eavesdrop? Okay, you overhear the conversation, and here's what you hear. All right, and forgive me for my very bad impression, but if it makes you laugh, it'll be good. All right, here you go. This is what you hear. "Father, don't leave me. Don't leave me, Father." The young man says to the older man, "Father, don't leave me." And the older man turns to his son as he was walking toward the water and turns back and grabs the young man by his shoulders and says, "Pedro, Pedro, my son, Pedro. You are so weak. Why are you crying? Boys don't cry, Pedro." And the young man says, "Father, Father, no, don't leave me, Father. Don't go back to Portugal. No, don't leave me." And the older man says, "Pedro, pull it together," and shakes him by his arms. And Pedro falls to his knees in the sand and is so sad. "Father, don't leave me. Take me back with you." And the king says, "Pedro, oh my gosh, I raised you to be braver than this. What is wrong with you?" And you're just trying not to crack up as you're walking by. Okay. My son, you must stay here. I have to go back. Napoleon has been seized. I have to go back. Father, I want to come with you." "No, Pedro, no, you must stay here in Brazil." And here's the final thing he says. "If you must declare independence, Pedro, Pedro," and he goes and he grabs him by his arms and he shakes him and he says, "Look at me, Pedro. If you must declare independence, do it with you on the throne." Okay, now you can open your eyes. I know that's absolutely ridiculous, but I guarantee. I always whenever I think of this scene, I don't know why, I think of crazy things sometimes, okay? Like, world history is crazy, okay? But I think of a scene on a beach, and I don't know about you, I think of some, daytime soap opera, okay? You know how soap operas are, right? They can be, super dramatic or something like that. But this is an actual quote from the book. So if you were to go look in the chapter, this is an actual quote from the book that the King of Portugal said to his son. The last thing he said to his son was, "If you are going to declare independence, do it with you on the throne." So what makes the Venezuelan, I'm sorry, not Venezuela, what makes the Brazilian move for independence or revolution different? Well, they talked about it in the crash course video, right? Almost no bloodshed. Why? Because it was calculated. That's why. Because it was calculated between father and son. Because the King of Portugal saw what was happening, saw the revolutions going on around him, left his son behind on purpose and said, I quote, "If you must declare independence, do it with you on the phone. Do it with you on the throne." In fact, I like my accent better. "Pedro, if you must declare independence, do it with you on the throne." Right? And Pedro is so heartbroken because he doesn't want his father to leave, but he has been given a task. That is why there was little to no bloodshed. They broke away from Portugal officially, and they set up what kind of government? A constitutional monarchy, which guess what? They didn't follow. Think about this. Why was there no bloodshed? The people got what they wanted in that, oh yay, we're broken away from Europe. But did anything really change? No. You have the king's son on the throne. Who do you think they're writing letters back and forth to? His dad. He's taking instructions from his dad right there. It was his dad's own instruction. His dad knew what was coming. His dad saw what was happening with Spain and all the Spanish colonies and said, let's get ahead of it. If we're going to lose it, all I really care about, I don't really care if I'm in charge of it. I care if I get the economics from it, which if my son is in charge, do you guys see this? If my son's in charge, I can still get the raw goods. I can still get the sugar. Brazil was the #1 producer of sugar in the world. So if my son stays on the throne, I have sugar. If there's a long, drawn-out independence, it's bloodshed, it's no production, economics go down. So it's a win-win. So what makes the what makes the Brazilian Revolution so different is that little to no bloodshed. It was Portuguese, but it was calculated. And really, in the end, nothing really changed. And the constitutional monarchy just was a continue of a monarchy, basically. They wrote up a constitution, make everybody feel good, like, see here, yay, you have rights now, that they don't enforce. A constitution is worthless, just like laws, if you don't enforce it. It's like a speed limit, right? We've talked about this before. If there's a speed limit, but there's never any cops to pull you over, if there's never the fear of getting a ticket, then it's pointless, right? If there's no consequences. So he declares himself king. They write up a constitution, so everybody in theory, like, yes, good, we're free. But behind closed doors, nothing really changes. Okay, the Mexican Revolution. What was different about that? Well, it was led by the Creoles, right? It was led by internal conflict, and there was many layers to the Mexican Revolution, right? There was many, many layers to it. It was very bloody. There was many phases to it. And in the end, it very much like Brazil ends with, yes, they're free of the Spanish, but the rich get richer and the poor are not really addressed. And even today, Mexico has issues with their elections, with bribery, with the police force, I had friends back in college, no joke, that went to Mexico for spring break, and stuff, drove and stuff like that, and their car was stolen. So they go to the police, oh my gosh, our car was stolen, expecting to get help. Basically, we're told to come back with $600 the next day and their car would show up. Well, having no other option, they show up with $600 the next day. The police said, come back the next day, and guess what appeared? Their car. It's riddled with corruption. Now, that doesn't mean that all politicians or all police officers in Mexico are corrupt, but there is a long history of corruption within the government, of rigged elections, of coups, of briberies, of the cartels, bribing politicians and people at the expense of the poor. And so even though they gained independence from the Spanish, they traded one dictator for another. And they still have issues today and struggles today with representation and the gap between the rich and the poor. Okay, let's talk about Venezuela really quick. Okay, so number 3, how did Simón Bolívar try to emulate the United States in his fight for independence in Latin and South America? Well, he led the Venezuelan Revolution and set up what was called the Gran Colombia, right? From 1819 to 1830. Now, the Gran Colombia, he tried to make a version of the United States, okay, with Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Okay, he was a personalist leader. He tried to copy the U.S. Constitution, just like the French did. The U.S. Constitution kind of became the blueprint that others would take and modify from. So all early constitutions kind of took the U.S. Constitution and then modified from that. All right, it kind of became the blueprint and they would modify from that. Unfortunately, he was not successful in the long run. And the reason for that was the regionalism that we talked about earlier, right? The diversity. And again, people were not used to it. They were used to having a dictatorship that was the Spanish. When you aren't trained in democracy, you don't know how to take it. Everybody's a good winner. Not everybody's a good loser. We've all been around a bad loser, right? If you've ever been involved in sports or a competition, that person that is a really bad loser, right, who doesn't know how to take it. People who are not used to democracy, whenever you jump from a monarchy, which is one end of the spectrum, to democracy, which is the other end of the spectrum, they always fail the first time in history. This is why all revolutions other than the American Revolution failed the first, second, third time. Everywhere. Because they have no practice. You have to have practice. Think about anything in life. Think about the first time you tried to write an AP essay. We're still working on them, right? And we're still struggling. They failed. The reason that the American colonists were successful was because they had practice. What's between a monarchy and democracy? A constitutional monarchy. It's where you have a monarch, but you have a constitution. So you have a limit to that monarch's laws where you have representation that helps vote on what the monarch can and cannot do. So monarchs make some decisions, but the representative body makes some decisions. And they had that experience in Britain. Britain was the first country, earliest country, dating all the way back to 1215, to have a constitutional monarchy, okay, with the Magna Carta. So they had practice. So when the American colonists went from a constitutional monarchy to a democracy. It was the next step. Was it hard? Absolutely. We had a civil war. We almost fell apart. We almost couldn't take it, but we held it together. So if we almost can't take it with our experience with the roots of the British constitutional monarchy, how are people that have no experience, very little to no education, going to jump from a monarchy to democracy? It's not going to happen. And people who get in positions of power when they don't get their way, or it's time for them to leave, or the election doesn't go their way, there's going to be a coup, there's going to be a military uprising. It's going to happen every time. Every single time. Even in France. France was educated. France had much higher rates of education. They were considered industrialized, right, compared to Latin America. They couldn't pull it off. You saw what they started doing. The Jacobins started executing everybody. So here's what I'm trying to say. And this kind of takes us down to, why did the newly independent Latin American states struggle to create lasting constitutions as seen in the United States? Heritage. They didn't have the heritage. The American colonists had the roots, the heritage of the British government, right? Of Parliament, the House of Representatives. They were used to voting on things. Doesn't mean you always get your way, but they're used to having a say, representation. Latin America, the French, they had no heritage, they had no practice. Lack of education. There was a lack of education. So, first of all, lack of roots and experience, and second, lower education rates definitely played a part of that. Just not understanding how things worked and having overall a lower literacy rate, lower education rate definitely hurt those success rates. Okay? And I hope that you can kind of see that. It's like anything in life. There's no way that as a first grader that you were ready to take AP World History, to be a sophomore in high school, right? You had to train for it over time. How are people who have worked in the fields, lived very simple lives, just worrying about where their bread is going to come from tomorrow, how are they prepared for democracy? Understanding what it is, how it works. When you don't get what you want, what does that look like? Understanding the concept of accepting majority rule, compromise, they've had no experience with. Their whole life, they've just been told what to do. It's something they have no practice with. And so it's part of the reason that these countries struggle so much to create stability. So my goal is not only for you to understand Latin American revolutions, but to understand revolutions in general and why pretty much all fail. They break away from their monarch. That's the easy part. But the goal is never accomplished, to set up peaceful representative governments. And look at what we've looked at so far. France can't do it. Latin America can't do it. And when we get to Asia, when we get to China, and we get to other countries that are developed and stuff like that, they fail to do it. Russia, they fail to do it. And it's going to be for the exact same reasons. Okay, so part of what makes you good at history is not memorizing all the facts, it's seeing the trends. Okay, seeing the trends. All right, you're awesome. This is going to wrap up this chapter, okay, and you should be done with your worksheet. And I've actually gone over quite a few facts, so you should be able to go and get your questions done. Hope you guys are doing great. Talk to you later.